Welcome, everyone. We're just going to give it one more minute as everyone settles in. It looks like we've got lots of people jumping into the jumping in from the waiting room right now. So we will let all of them get settled in and get started. We have what I'm hoping will be a very interactive panel today. We are hoping to have a more roundtable style discussion. We more than welcome audience input, some questions, and I will give a brief overview of kind of what we're talking about today as we go and get started. But go ahead and give us just a few more seconds to settle in and get ready. All right, looks like Teresa has the waiting room under control. We'll go ahead and get started. So welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Good morning, good evening, good night. Thank you especially to everyone in Australia, Asia, Africa, Europe who are up late. Good morning to those of you in Seattle who think that this panel is at a great time. And we're happy to have you all here. Please, we'll be talking about global cross-regional issues today, so feel free to ask about the region you're in or the region you work in. We are not discriminating against any specific time zone. So the first thing I want to start with is thanking all of the coordinators of this conference. I know it has not been easy, especially with the pivot to full virtual in the last 2 months. And I think just want to really show our appreciation to the Environmental Peacebuilding Association and all of the people who made it happen, from the tech side to all of the people who are working on social media and Carl Brook and everyone. I really appreciate the work that you put in to make this accessible for all of us, even during the times of COVID. So we're really excited to still be able to gather and get together to say this. To talk. So this session is part of the Second International Conference on Environmental Peacebuilding, and we want to encourage you to check out the rest of the agenda. All of the sessions are free, which is absolutely amazing. Most conferences of this caliber are extremely expensive, so you're really in for quite a treat. I just dropped the link to the rest of the agenda in the chat box. And Teresa will be dropping in the code of conduct for the rest of the session. I think you guys can all figure out pretty much what that says, but there is a link to go and check out the exact wording. Just please no rude language, harassment, anything that you wouldn't say to or in front of your grandmother. And let's keep it civil and let's enjoy a good discussion. So to start off, I'm Emily Sample. I'm Programs Director at the Fund for Peace, and I will be moderating today's session and hopefully keeping control of a lively discussion. And what we are going to do today is, instead of having each of our esteemed presenters present a paper or a presentation, we wanted to open up the conversation a little bit. So instead, we'll do a quick overview of each of their introductions, less than 10 minutes each, and that'll give you an idea of what each of them is working on and what kind of questions you can ask them. And then from there, we will jump right into a discussion session. So feel free to raise your hand, And I will call on you and you can unmute and ask your question, or you are more than welcome to write out your question in the chat box. The only thing I ask is that you do introduce yourself, either in verbally or in the chat. Just give us an idea of who you are, and if your question is for someone specific or for the entire panel. Without further ado, I'd like to get started with Paul Turner. Would you please introduce yourself and give us an idea of what you'll be talking about today?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to join you today. My name is Paul Turner. I work as a president and executive director at the Fund for Peace, and I'll present that overview that Emily was referencing just to walk through some long-running research that the fund has been doing and give you a sense of that. I've been looking forward to this panel and sharing just a little bit of my experiences and learning from you too.
If you want to go ahead and start your presentation, Paul, will just do introductions as we go along.
Great. So I'd mentioned that there's this long-standing piece of research that we've been working on. For more than 16 years now, the fund has been pulling together something called the Fragile States Index. It started out, I think, as a small initiative that just grew increasingly complex from the initial idea. It is now global in scope and covers 179 countries. You'll see on the screen some varying colors, and that's because those countries are laid out based on their degree of fragility. I think for those of you who have delved into the field of conflict for extensive periods of time, you may question the fact that why are we only focusing on fragility? And that's because this is more of a diagnostic tool. It's not meant to necessarily lead to programmatic recommendations. So we aren't dealing with resilience in this index, although if you'd like to revisit us later this year, probably midsummer, we'll have an index that's looking at degrees of resilience too. Our index measures structural vulnerabilities and pressures. It's focused on the national level. So a lot of places will see things taking place, whether it's regionally or subnationally, and that while that may be captured, it's not the area of focus that we're zeroing in on. There's 12 separate indicators, and I'll get to those in just 1 minute. But I'd like to be able to advance over to the next screen and just reinforce the fact that this is something that's diagnostic, that it's really looking at pressures, not necessarily the people's or the government's ability to withstand those pressures or to respond to those, but just look at that degree of fragility. Because we've been able to run this for quite some time now, while we're presenting a bit of a snapshot, we feel like it's most valuable looking at it as a dynamic tool to be able to look at what trends we see taking place over time. I think that those stories are much more interesting than what you might see a presentation of a particular country in any given year. And again, this is based on a series of indicators and not necessarily offering a holistic summary of the undisputed truth. So within the index itself, I'm just going to give you a quick overview. We won't geek out too much with this, but those 12 indicators are presented here on the right, and they're broken up into some different categories. The indicators looking at issues of cohesion, indicators looking at political issues, economic, social, and then cross-cutting indicators. I think that one of the first questions, hopefully those of you in the audience might be asking yourselves is, where does environment come in? How can I find issues of climate change, etc.? And I would argue that we are capturing those things, but they're cross-cutting in ways that we might see issues of youth or gender surfacing across these different categories. And I'll talk about that more in just a second. But I wanted to give you just a moment to kind of look through the different types of indicators, from state legitimacy, issues of demographics, et cetera, that we see surfacing. Next, I talked about how we look at environmental issues being cross-cutting, and I wanted to present a few examples of that. So public services maybe sounds like something that you might relegate to those who are trying to figure out when to pick up the trash. And that is an important part of it, but it's also looking not just at waste removal, but also at infrastructure and how that's being designed. Is it being designed to be able to mitigate rising sea levels as a result of climate change, et cetera? How are the people being involved in that process? I think also there's another indicator dealing with external intervention that looks at what donors are doing, who are the donors that are involved, what are they doing in terms of funding food, water, energy infrastructure, why are they doing those things, and giving us another set of perspectives as to what might be taking place to help us understand issues of fragility. Another key one that we'll see is the role of factionalized elites that plays out in every country around the world. And I think when we're looking at environmental issues, we can look at who's controlling those issues, how are the elites involving those resources in patronage systems, how are they being distributed. And I think one of the other key issues that isn't necessarily linked directly to environment, but is linked directly to climate change is the refugee crisis. And that is ongoing, and that is expected to increase as a result of climate pressures and increasing levels of fragility in many countries and regions around the world. And so again, we don't have a specific indicator that is focused on environmental issues, that is focused on climate change, but I think in most, if not all, of these indicators that we've identified, you'll see elements that are surfacing that are capturing some of those dynamics. I think that the key one is really looking at demographic pressures. It's looking at those pressures that are responding to issues that may be resulting from shortages in the environment, whether that's water, access to land, other resources, looking at the demographic pressures that may be the result of extreme weather conditions and how people are being able to be prepared to mitigate those, to respond to those, what the government's doing, et cetera. So I think in short, and I've been trying to go really quickly, hopefully you get a sense of there being a large number of variations of fragility around the world. And that fragility is not rooted in any one particular thing, but in a host of things that we're trying to capture through these separate indicators that play off of each other and create almost like an equation to be able to form that degree of fragility that we're presenting through this index. I don't think that it holds any inherent truths, but it does give us the opportunity to depart from a shared understanding and engage in conversations about risks that we're confronting, and potentially be able to depart from there and ask ourselves, so what are we going to do about it? So again, I'll leave it on this page just for one more second as we're transitioning into the next speaker. I'm happy to tackle any questions that may surface, but I wanted to make sure that we were focused on interaction a little bit more than me being a talking head. So thank you for your time.
Great, thanks so much, Paul. I think that gave us all a great place to start the conversation off and get a solid foundation in the concepts of fragility as we are discussing them today. I'll take this opportunity to introduce Jessica, who will be telling us, who is joining us from International Alert.
Thank you, Emily, and hello everybody. So my name is Jessica Hartog, and I work with International Alert, which is an international peacebuilding organization. And personally, I work on kind of the nexus of climate change, natural resource management / environmental issues, and conflict and peacebuilding. And that's also what I want to kind of spend a few minutes on as an introductory remark. But Emily, shall I go ahead, or do you want to say something? Yeah. Okay.
Yep,
cool.
Go for it.
Thank you. So in our work, we see that fragility is increasingly linked to climate change impacts and also unprecedented environmental degradation that we all will recognize that that's happening all across the world. And it's really considered, as we know, one of the biggest challenges or obstacles to reaching the Sustainable Development Goals. The causal link between climate change and fragility and conflict is not straightforward and highly context specific, really dependent on various of the indicators that the Fragile States Index works with, such as already that Paul explained earlier. We do see though some patterns which we could call kind of common pathways, and I just want to take a brief moment to explain the three kind of pathways in terms of the link between climate and conflict. The first one is that people need stable livelihoods to basically sustain themselves, to sustain their well-being. However, environmental degradation and also extreme weather events can really negatively impact on people's livelihoods, and it can have really a crippling effect on people's food security, and all of that can kind of contribute to rising social tensions. So that's one pathway how we see the link between climate and conflict. A second one is that climate change can contribute to increased population mobility, whereby the kind of influx of people within a country or across borders can really place an additional burden on local economies, on the public services, which can again raise kind of risks of conflict. And an added challenge is that in these contexts where kind of migrant population and host populations are coming together, kind of the existing kind of mechanisms for conflict resolution will also be under pressure, because they don't necessarily enjoy the legitimacy of all the different groups that are kind of living together now. So that's a second pathway around basically migration. A third pathway is the disruption and desperation that can be caused by increased competition over resources and extreme weather events, which can really be exploited by elite groups, by criminal groups, or even violent extremist groups for their own political or economic kind of purposes. And we see particularly where governments are unable or unwilling to effectively kind of respond to these threats, that there is this pathway that can unfold between climate and conflicts. And we have seen this in emerging basically in various countries. Just want to kind of maybe briefly mention Syria. We all know the kind of the state of the country that it's in at the moment, but it all kind of started, I think, between 2006 and 2011, when there was a 5-year drought, on top of already a very kind of long-term, prolonged kind of unsustainable use of water for irrigation of agricultural land. And that situation of that prolonged drought and that unsustainable management of water really kind of forced over 1 million people, farming families mainly, away from their farming lands to move to urban areas, which is widely believed to have contributed to the conflict that has devastated the country. And then also we see in neighboring Iraq, in several cities, people have taken to the streets in recent years to voice their anger over the poor access to clean water. But again, instead of listening and seeking a solution to the water crisis, the authorities have responded with excessive force. And the situation both in Iraq and Syria really illustrates how state fragility can hamper government's ability to respond to climate change and manage natural resources in a sustainable and equitable way. Actually, what we really see is that there can be a vicious cycle emerging whereby poor governance takes attention and resources away from adequately responding to climate challenges, which in turn then leaves communities more vulnerable, again exacerbating existing fragilities, with the potential to translate into conflicts. So kind of looking towards the future, climate change and its impacts will worsen. I'm sure everybody will recognize And we will witness that the underlying pressures of climate change will kind of keep building in the background, interacting with fragility factors. So yeah, kind of quantitative tools like this, the Fragile States Index is really important for us to kind of understand how climate and environmental factors affect livelihoods, migration, social tensions, and violence. And if we then kind of couple that with kind of qualitative analysis, this will really kind of be necessary to inform the climate resilience building strategies that we so desperately need, and especially the people in conflict and fragile affected countries. But I will stop there, Emily, so that the other speakers also have enough time to share their reflections. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jessica. I look forward to asking some more questions about what you were just sharing. We will go over to Dan. Let's go listen to Dan's introduction.
Thanks very much, Emily, and thank you, Jessica and Paul. So, a quick introduction about who I am. So I'm Daniel Woodburn, Programs Associate at the Fund for Peace. My personal interest and my presence on this panel stems from a long-standing, maybe 10-year-long interest in the linkages between conflict and climate change, dating back to my studies, and which has just grown from there. And in the context of the FSI, and based on what has been said so far, I want to sort of emphasize that the FSI is considered a systemic analysis tool, one that aims to capture the constituent elements of what a state is, and therefore the events, the various elements that affect a state's ability to fulfill the social contract. And in parallel, climate change can be considered a threat of a systemic nature. So in the case of the FSI, this would, on the face of it, most likely manifest itself in changes to a country's demographic pressure score, whereby the immediate and more tangible impacts of climate events are felt by a country's population. But it's more complex than that, and that only paints half the picture, really. The impacts of climate events are rarely isolated to just one indicator. They're more cross-cutting and just more systemic, essentially. And with an increase in the severity of climate events, extreme climate events, comes an increasing likelihood of cascading effects, whether this be at the economic, social, cultural, ecological, or political level, and thereby bringing several other indicators into play. And therefore, across an entire year, and the FSI does measure events across the calendar year, a significant climate event risks impacting scores across the board for a given country, especially as the repercussions of the climate event play out over time. And this is all the more so the case when a country's comparative size means the effects of a climate event cannot easily be absorbed. And when I talk about size, I'm not just talking about its geographic extent, I'm also talking about population, and a subsector of which is population density, but also the size of its economy, for instance. And to illustrate this, I would use the example of the Bahamas, which in 2020, in the 2020 Fragile States Index, experienced a significant decline in its score, and this after years of improvement. And the reason being that in September 2019, Hurricane Dorian wrought destruction upon the country during a short but intense 48-hour window. High winds and storm surges devastated much of the small low-lying country, specifically two islands. And the hurricane had obvious direct destructive consequences in terms of infrastructural damage, but also long-term ones in terms of the impact on the economy and the tourism industry, both of which go hand in hand. The economy, in as much as an estimated $3.4 billion worth of destruction was wrought upon the country, which at the time was equivalent to about 25% of the GDP. And so those are the more obvious impacts of climate change on a country. But in the context of this discussion and the framing around climate conflict, there are a couple of less obvious impacts upon some of the indicators of the FSI. So there was an increase in looting, for instance, and an uptick in the use of firearms in the period immediately before and after the hurricane made landfall. So before, as panic set in, and after, as supplies were difficult to come by. And this was seemingly enough to contribute to a worsening in the Bahamas security apparatus score, which is one of our 12 indicators. And this serves to underscore the point that climate change manifests itself across the board, not just across one or two or three indicators. Paul had mentioned three so far, where environment is clearly a factor. But the point is that climate change, environment, gender, as you mentioned, they're all cross-cutting, and they can all be visible. They're all visible across the 12 indicators. And so the hurricane was arguably the cause for an apparent reversal in a long-term improvement of the Bahamas score, and its recovery was subsequently hampered by COVID-19. And this just serves to underscore the point that various shocks, various pressures can be compounding. The Bahamas was already reeling following the hurricane, but COVID-19 only exacerbated this. And it wasn't necessarily a health issue for the Bahamas, but it was very much an economic one, in as much as the tourism industry, which was already struggling and on its knees, was hit with a second blow. And so the Bahamas, I use it as an example of how a climate shock can manifest itself on the FSI scores. But what about climate pressure, such as drought, heat waves, or coastal erosion? Now, there's a distinction to be made between shock and pressure, in as much as shock is something concentrated in a relatively short window, and pressure is more long-standing, multi-month, multi-year pressures upon vulnerabilities. And that's not to say it's any less nefarious. It can in fact be slightly more nefarious, because in the face of pressure which is extended over several years, it's easy to become complacent, and it's easy to just accept that that's the way it is. Whereas a shock, you plan for it, or you do your best, and there are humanitarian responses to a shock. But pressures are slightly more drawn out, they're more chronic, essentially. And that's, hopefully we can delve into this a little more later on, but that's the main distinction between shock and pressure. And so in that respect, I think the Sahel is a very pertinent example of climate pressures, certainly in as much as it's a region that has been identified by the UN Under Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief, Mark Lowcock, as being our biggest worry over the long term. One need only look at Mali in recent days, where the French ambassador was evicted from the country, to get a sense of the continued degradation of the relationship between the two countries, and to see that such concerns are very much warranted. And that is just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, that comes in the context of 10 years of continued deterioration of the security situation. And many have gone as far as to call Mali France's Afghanistan, in as much as the struggle against religious extremism or jihadist activity is seemingly an intractable conflict, or worse still, an unwinnable one. And unfortunately, the parallels just keep on growing. And the reason I'm bringing that up, and the reason I couched it with the example of the Bahamas, is that West Africa is very much at the center of this notion of climate security, and the Sahel first and foremost. And Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, they're all members, they're all West African countries, they're all members or suspended members of the ECOWAS community. And plenty has been written academically about the countries involved in Operation Barkhane, for instance, so which is to say, the countries in the Sahel, so Mauritania, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, as well as the deteriorating security situation, the increased frequency of coups, whether successful, as was the case for Burkina Faso recently, or unsuccessful, as in Guinea-Bissau yesterday, though it's not a Sahel country. And more has been written still about the increasing icy relations between France and its Sahelian allies. But more to the point, plenty has been written about the role that climate change plays in all this, and its role as a multiplying factor. And it's very difficult to unravel climate change from the wider situation. That's a very complex task, but it's certainly one which is certainly a worthwhile exercise. And establishing just what role climate change has to play in it is what draws me to, is why I agreed to be on this panel, and why I take such an interest in all of this, because it is undeniably a multiplying factor. It is undeniably a very important factor in all of this. Nevertheless, it's very difficult to say climate change was the spark to the gunpowder, for instance. But as Jessica pointed out, there are plenty of examples, such as Syria, where you can certainly identify an environmental aspect or a climate change aspect to a conflict. And so, a significant amount of literature has been produced on the role that climate change plays in the deteriorating fragility of states, and the FSI largely bears witness to this, or at least it reflects a systematic increase in fragility that mirrors growing climate threats in many countries. And I think this raises a very interesting question, and hopefully one which we can elaborate upon during this panel, which is, what can the FSI tell us about the risk of climate conflict for West Africa more broadly, in as much as Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are not necessarily representative of the rest of the ECOWAS community, with every other country being a coastal state. Thank you.
Wow, that was a lot to process. Thank you, Dan. I have so many follow-up questions to ask, so I'm excited to get into the discussion section. But first, I want to introduce our next panelist, Wendy, who will be touching on what several of our other speakers have already noted, which is the importance of gender in this conversation.
Thanks, Emily. I'm not sure how you follow up Dan's fantastic presentation, but I'm going to try to do so. Like Emily said, I am Wendy Wilson, a programs manager at the Fund for Peace, working on research and policy programs about human security, conflict, fragility, and resilience. A specialized focus of this work also includes looking at how gender intersects with these areas, which is what I will be focusing on primarily during this roundtable discussion. My presentation will be sequenced as such. I will be starting very broadly and then narrowing down into the topic of discussion. Specifically, I will first start by looking at how gender more broadly is integrated into the FSI. Then I will look at how the nexus of gender and climate insecurity is accounted for in the FSI. I will then finish up my presentation by talking about the gender dimensions of climate insecurity and conflict by drawing upon a few illustrative case studies and examples. So gender and the FSI. It is important to note that from the FFP perspective, when we speak of gender, we don't mean to conflate it with women or only define gender issues as women issues. So with that being said, with the FSI, gender is mainstreamed across the 12 indicators. For example, under state legitimacy, which Paul introduced earlier, which examines the representativeness and openness of the government and its relationship to its citizenry, we consider things like the makeup of the government. Is the government representative of the population? Another example is our public services indicator, which refers to the presence of basic state functions that serve the people. Here, questions can revolve around public services equality. Is there equal access to public services? This means both access as defined by geography, rural and urban divide, and access as defined by gender. We also have questions that pertain to education. Are literacy rates different for boys versus girls? Is the level of enrollment different for boys versus girls? And finally, we also have demographic pressures, which naturally is the main indicator that some of you may have zeroed in on and will serve as the springboard for our look into how gender and climate is accounted for in the FSI. So, under demographic pressures, questions are inherently gendered and look at things like the impact of natural disasters. But as shared by Paul and Dan earlier, given that climate change is a cross-cutting issue that goes beyond just the environment, the effects of climate change are also captured in several different indicators with questions that allow for the assessment of gendered considerations. Over the last few years, FFP has conducted a variety of comprehensive assessments to better understand how gender issues, climate change, and insecurity are interconnected in sub-Saharan Africa. Already in sub-Saharan Africa, entrenched social cultural norms and structural factors, such as the ineffective implementation of equitable and inclusive legislation, when they exist, contributes to deep-rooted societal inequalities that distinctly and disproportionately expose women and girls to risk in cases of conflict and social political emergencies. So climate insecurity is another critical risk in the ever-changing context of human security threats, acting as a threat multiplier, like Jessica said, by inflaming pre-existing pressures and contributing to inequalities between men and women. The first illustrative case study is the Lake Chad Basin crisis. In the Lake Chad Basin, which is one of the most prevalent embodiments of how climate and insecurity interacts, we found through our research that men often act as violence actors, while women assume the role of victims and are subjected to kidnappings, rape, and forced marriage. The lake, which was once the 6th largest lake in the world, has shrank incredibly, primarily due to climate change and harmful human practices like damming and water diversion. What is interesting to note, though, is the poor quality of the already shrinking lake has also been driven by Boko Haram, who also benefit from this. So these interrelated factors through our research show that they've contributed to the worsening of food and water insecurity. In the Lake Chad Basin region, water roles are gendered, with women traditionally assuming duties around water collection and water management. So with the role that conflict and insecurity plays in this area, we found that this has resulted in long travel and wait times at water sources for women, putting them at a higher risk of abuse. This extra time spent on locating and accessing new water sites also impacts their ability to engage in beneficial activities to elevate their status in society, whether it be regular school attendance or income generating opportunities. This example highlights that the gendered impact of climate change and insecurity are cascading and a lot more complex and cross-cutting, as Paul, Dan, and Jessica have already shared. For men, what we found was that the insecurity that is driven by climate change in the region means that men take on personal risks to live up to the social expectations that call on them to provide for their families, whether it be them joining Boko Haram and engaging in terrorist activities. FFP's research has also focused on transhumans and pastoralist conflicts. In the West Africa region, rainfall variability and desertification has limited the availability of fertile land, and also has in turn increased resource competition and heightened farmer-herder tensions in a number of countries, including Nigeria and Niger. The recurrence of such latent intercommunal conflicts impacts both women and men, but disproportionately impacts women. As with the Lake Chad Basin case, men take on personal risks to live up to social expectations. For women, the loss of a husband or a male head of household in conflict and insecurity driven by climate change and pastoralist conflicts means that women are often rendered homeless, since they're often prevented from owning and controlling land in some rural communities. Across both of these case studies, it is important to recognize that these intercommunal conflicts and their impact on women aren't only immediate, but can also be experienced intergenerationally. What do I mean by this? So when women are rendered homeless because their men have been killed in conflicts, what this means that women have to take on coping mechanisms to ensure that they can be financially secure. So we find that women then consider selling or trafficking their children, specifically girl children, to feed themselves. Girl children because they're considered valueless in a male-dominated society. So I hope that was able to give you a brief overview as to how climate insecurity and conflict intersects with gender. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Wendy. That was so interesting. And we already have some questions coming in. I think we'll have lots to talk about there. And finally, I'd like to introduce you to Liz Hume, who will be culminating our introductions before we open up the conversation to the rest of the audience. Liz?
Okay, well, thank you so much. So I'm Liz Hume, and I'm the Executive Director at the Alliance for Peacebuilding. We just had a big PeaceCon last week. So I'm going to do something a little different based on some of the research that came out of that conference. It's not going to be easy, so I would actually love people's feedback on if it worked or not. So I'm going to use the research, the social science research on narratives that we presented, talked about at the conference, and how we tell our story. So we always start with the problem. And when I say we, I mean me, always start with the problem. And what we've learned is that it immediately puts us in survival mode. And we talk about, and it taps into our fear. And nothing can be scarier than conflict and climate change, either violent conflict or climate change. And together, at the fact that they compound each other, that's already really scary. And I know we've all tapped into the fear of what we're already thinking about those two issues. We also know that just raising awareness isn't enough. I'm always, so I've been like knocking my, I don't understand, like it's so clear, and we give all these great facts, and we do, and it's, it's not making that narrative change. Also, when we just give a lot of facts, they're hard to stick. And that's why I'm such a big fan of the Fragile State Index. If I say it all the time, because it's a great visual you can go to, and good data is important. And I always say this: good data equals policies. Okay, so now I'm going to circle back. Once I'm telling you this is what I'm doing, how do I make the case that we need to care about the issue, the compounding issue of conflict, violent conflict, and climate change? So first of all, what we do know, we need to focus on solutions. And then I got to repeat them and repeat them and repeat them. And that's how we tell our story better. And that's what we heard over the conference last week. We don't tell our story very well. Okay, so now you know what I'm doing. Okay, we know these issues compound each other. They're not just additive. So I'm not going to talk about the scary things. If you want those stats, I put in the chat box AFP's policy on climate change and conflict. It's all there. You can get very scared by all those things that are happening. Okay, so hope and solutions. So that's where I'm going to go with this, hope and solutions. And the first message I have is from the US side, because I know this is probably a US audience, since we're at about 3:42 this afternoon, and most people in Europe hopefully are asleep by now or getting to sleep. Oh my gosh, the US policies are so much better. Under the Obama administration, when he came in, and everybody in, who was in the US government, we were all like, this is so exciting, things are going to change. They didn't. They started in the last 2 years of his administration. Under former President Trump, nobody could even say the word climate change in the US. Couldn't even say it. DOD got away with it a little bit. They called it a threat multiplier, but that was it. So President Obama's Global Climate Action Plan, it proposed this reduction in carbon dioxide, preserving forests, encouraging the use of alternative fuels. But okay, again, didn't get implemented. The Trump administration threw it out. Okay. Everybody in the US administration pretty much left. The place got gutted. There was very little there. So, okay, that's where we were. But the Biden administration has reversed all that and done more than any administration has done. They've appointed former Secretary of State John Kerry as the first special presidential envoy for climate. They have done executive orders from almost day one, tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad, planning for the impact of climate change on migration, the climate crisis and US foreign policy. You can go on and on and on. And that's really exciting, and we should cheer, and that should give us hope. They also unveiled a new climate finance commitments, and USAID's new agency-wide climate strategy is out for comment. It was released in November 2021. It's gonna come out in 2022. Again, phenomenal. Reducing global greenhouse gases, helping countries increase their resilience to global climate change. This, you could go rooted in inclusion and equity. They're going to help 45 countries to, you could go on and on and on and on, and that's all great. And they talk about integrating mainstreaming climate considerations across USAID's portfolio, blah, 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 blah. That is phenomenal. However, what do we know? Look at USAID's, look at the US government's COVID strategy. They talk about second order issues in there. They talk about conflict, which I don't believe is a second order issue, but that's my own issue with the strategy. Not one dime has gone to it. So even though all these great words are in there, if it doesn't get implemented, just words on a paper, that's all it is. So this is where I'm going to go with my points. We need to be clear, and I'm going to repeat this and repeat this and repeat this and try to make it as clear as possible. We are going to need standalone conflict and peace building and environment, climate change programs. Why? Because, as I say, as a conflict expert, you kind of got to be an expert on everything, a little bit of expert on everything, because you go where those conflict dynamics are, and they could be anywhere and everywhere in a country. And especially, and what we now know, climate change has no one's immune from it, including the United States. No one's immune from it. No one's exceptional. Some places will do better. Some places will do exceptionally worse. And so I think that that's the really important piece of it. So what do we need to do? We need to make sure that the US administration, the UN, and every other donor increases their focus on climate mitigation and adaptation. I'll say that again. Increase your focus on climate mitigation and adaptation. That is key. How do you do it? We need to require conflict governance and humanitarian assessments to integrate climate change, risk, and identification of adaptation opportunities where relevant. We need to target the strategies in food security that we know are critical of building resilience, to address severe droughts, floods, waterborne diseases. One of the things I, want to say is, again, the US, not immune. You don't have to look so far as Texas when their governance issue with their electrical grid. They had that massive snap ice snowstorm, and Senator Cruz, you saw a lot of issues around governance issues that they weren't taking it seriously, and have not still taken it seriously. And you have this whole governance issue there that in Texas right now on their electrical grid. Okay, so that, is how you would look at climate mitigation and adaptation, right? So it's the climate, mitigation aspect of it and adaptation. I keep saying that because that's what we're looking at doing, and it really focuses a lot on governance. And the second point is really incorporating risk-reducing conflict prevention programs. And this is to deal with climatic hazards so that they don't exacerbate violent conflict. And so many great examples here today of all the, Somalia and the drought. And I was listening to everybody. So it falls into two categories. Well, three categories. We want standalone programs because we know sometimes environmental issues, climate change issues are driving conflict. They just are straight up driving conflict. Standalone peace building programs. We need to have an integrated focus on climate mitigation and adaptation. That has to be in the strategy that's coming out. And looking at that prevention piece of it. And then the risk reducing conflict prevention programs into the climatic hazards. Because why is that so important for us? Because you can have all the you can meet all your conflict dynamics. You can have your grievances, you can have your resiliencies, your negative resiliencies, you can have key actors, you can have the means, you can have all these things But a lot of times you don't see, even though countries sit high on the conflict watch list or on the FSI, you know, I use Ethiopia as an example. It sat for years and years and years at around number 19. But, you know, there was really no chance that at that time, under its former government, that conflict would happen. But what happens? You have triggering events. And we know that issues, you know, climatic hazards, just like elections, droughts, have triggering impact on all our different conflict dynamics, and can cause, can be that thing that triggers conflict. So that's really important. Okay, so that's what I've done. And I'd love to hear everybody's thoughts on that, if that was clear and made you feel more hopeful and not so depressed. And you know, your brain's all on fear. One last thing I really want to talk about really quickly is the GFA, the Global Fragility Act. This is a great vehicle to move and start addressing and looking at these issues. Again, when the strategy was developed under the former administration, climate change could not be set. Under the new strategy or the revised strategy that will be coming out, and even in the selection of countries and regions, I mean, one of the things that I and the Global Fragility Act Coalition has really pushed for is looking at a country or a region where climate change is impacting conflict dynamics. And then how do we analyze it and make sure that we are addressing it instead of just analyzing it and saying, oh, that's not good. Okay, so we'll do this education program over here. Not that there's anything wrong with education, but we have to address the drivers of conflict. And with that, I'm going to stop. And I hope that I was able to do the two things, get the information across and also do it in a new narrative way.
Thank you. Well, I feel more hopeful. I feel more hopeful because Liz is on this problem, right? I'm thrilled that we have a nice long question and answer session still ahead of us. So there is plenty of time for us to get to dig into some of this. So I want to invite the audience to either use the raise hand function, and I will ask you to unmute and you can share your own question, or you are welcome to put it in the chat box. As I mentioned at the top of the hour, if you would just introduce yourself real quick so we know who we're talking to and who your question is for, or if it is for everyone. And I have a million questions to start with, but I want to give the audience the first crack at it. All right, we have a hand. Chiara, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Hi, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. My name is Chiara Scissa. I'm a PhD student on environmental migration at the Sant'Anna School of Advanced Studies in Italy. And here it's very late, it's almost 10 p.m., but I'm still awake. So my question is for everybody, actually. I'm very much interested in fragile states. And I was wondering whether, given their inability or unwillingness to give effect to their very basic responsibilities, protection responsibilities, I was wondering whether these states may actually derogate from ordinary human rights law. Because, for instance, I know that some Central Asian countries subject to external invasion, they attempted to derogate from human rights treaties they have previously signed because they say that area and it is no longer under my jurisdiction, therefore I can't provide for human rights protection there. However, these declarations have been rejected by related human rights monitoring bodies because states have positive human rights obligations. So I was wondering if fragile states are somehow allowed or justified in derogating from some norms at the international level, or if this is not possible under any conditions. And thank you very much for this event and for all your presentations. It was very much interesting. Thank you very much.
Thanks for that excellent question. Who would like to take that question, looking at some of the governance issues within fragile states? Ooh, hearing none, I'm going to ask Jessica, because you have talked a little bit more about the governance side of things. Can you speak to that a little bit? Maybe.
Yeah, well, I was just thinking, because I mean, you're basically asking, Chiara, whether fragile states kind of would have a special kind of how do you say that, yeah, opportunity to deviate from human rights that states have all signed up to. And my response would be like no. Why would that be? It's just that, yeah, the accountability mechanisms in fragile states are poor, or maybe even in some states kind of absent, and yeah, they basically just get away with it. So yeah, that would be my response. But I don't know if there's anybody else in the audience, especially maybe if nobody from the panel is raising their hand, who has a bit more of a background in human rights, because I don't bring that to the panel. So yeah.
I know. Thank you so much, Jessica, for that answer. I do know that one of the things that is a climate justice issue is trying to help some of these fragile states, because they are contributing less to climate change, but are affected by it more. So one of the things that is in some of these, global conversations like Davos and the COP26 that was recently in Glasgow is looking at having some of the nations who are most responsible for climate change financially and infrastructurally assist the countries who are more affected by climate change, because they feel that they don't have, as Jessica noted, some of the abilities to handle this internally. So in that sense, no, I don't feel like they are should be given leeway on their human rights needs, but rather that they should be supported in their human rights needs, especially in terms of climate justice.
But Emily, can I jump in there? I mean, governance issues are so critical to this, because when you look at governance issues, how do they judge their government or their governance? Effective and legitimate. If your government is doing massive human rights violations and they can't address a climatic hazard that comes through effectively, like it's all part of the same genre. So one of the things, and that's why governance is so key on climate change, or climate change and conflict, is building fragile states so that they can show effective and legitimacy. And you just have to think about the United States. They couldn't, we got lucky. I always say this, we got really lucky on the vaccine. If we hadn't, what a disaster in terms of how effective the United States government was in dealing with the COVID crisis, as opposed to other states. So just as an example.
I wanted to jump in with one quick thing too, and that's to try and maybe double down on some of what Liz was sharing. I think that the ideas of governance, a lot of times we look purely at the government, and I think one of the main reasons in the world, according to Paul at least, that we see fragility take place is that the social contract between the people and their government is weak. or even broken. And so that fragility exists, whether you're looking at human rights, at reasonable and wise responses to the challenges of climate change, et cetera, because of that weakness, that lack of faith between the public and their institutions. And I think that the more that anywhere is able to try and bind that fabric that connects the people with the government, that you'll start to see that fragility decrease. And so whether you're, again, human rights, gender, pick your topic, hopefully you'll start to see gradual improvements there as you see a state become less fragile and ultimately more resilient.
So I am going to take my opportunity to use my moderator's rights and ask a question. And I don't know who's best to answer this, whether it's Dan or Wendy or Paul, but one of the things that you all reiterated was that the FSI is not predictive. But I think one of the ways that it is really essential is being used to understand patterns, right? So how, and maybe Dan can speak to this a little bit in looking at different case studies, how is the Fragile States Index can it be used not necessarily as predictive, but as a way of understanding of the way patterns are moving in a variety of different indicators?
I'd say the FSI, and it is important to emphasize that it isn't predictive, it's diagnostic rather than prognostic, can essentially just point you in the right direction and allow you to use various other tools at your disposal to identify what the issue is and what you can do. I'm not entirely sure if that answers your question. I just wanted to, because Emily, before you intervened, I wanted to raise my hand in the context of Chiara's question. So I'm not entirely sure if this is, altogether a different tangent, but I wanted to come back to what Chiara had asked about, accountability in the face of various international obligations and fragility, the linkages between the two. And I wanted to raise the example, and I'm not saying one example is indicative of a wider pattern or wider trend, but I wanted to use the example of Turkey, for instance, withdrawing from the Istanbul, the Istanbul Convention back in July last year. And that was important because it sort of harks to, you look at Turkey and you look at the decrease of its score over the past few years and its tendency towards authoritarianism by and large, in the broader sense of the term. And it's not altogether difficult to draw parallels with other countries. And you look at the US, for instance, since 2016, which experienced a significant decline in its score, and you look at the fact that it withdrew from the Paris Agreement. And it's not altogether difficult to see where Chiara is coming from, in as much as an increase in fragility has a tendency to go hand in hand with, and this isn't always the case, but can often go hand in hand with an increase in authoritarianism or authoritarian tendencies. And in that respect, that often manifests itself in an eschewal of international obligations and just this general consolidation of power, so to speak, and a refusal to adhere to international obligations and to just look inwardly. So I do apologize, Dimitri, if I went on a tangent, but I just wanted to come back to what Chiara had said.
Not a problem.
I can chime in on that. Go ahead, Emily. You or me?
You.
Okay. I was going to say I could chime in on that other question about how the FSI tool can be used. So once you're ready to get me to take it on, let me know.
Go for it.
Yes, so at FFP, we always emphasize that the FSI is not a predictive tool. And what we always try to note in these kind of talks and presentations and conversations with foundations and clients is that it is very important to look beyond the scores and look beyond the top line findings and rankings to really go below the surface to sort of review the health or status of a country. So it's always good to focus on what the year-on-year change might be or the long-term trends for these countries might have been. So as an example, for the 2021 FSI, I believe, the US worsened remarkably, but that wasn't a surprise for us at FFP because over the last 5 years or the 5 years preceding that, the US had worsened on the number of cohesion indicators remarkably. So if anyone wanted to use the FSI as a way to establish patterns and trends, we would recommend going beyond looking at the rankings and looking at the scores, because at that time, although the US had been worsening in rankings or scores, it hadn't been worsening that dramatically if you were only looking at top line findings. Another thing too that we recommend in using the FSI as a tool to establish patterns and trends, and Jessica actually did reference this, is to accompany this quantitative tool with qualitative assessments and additional research. So with us at FFP, what we do on occasion is to accompany the FSI tool with research, whether it be desk research or field research, but also with other conflict mapping platforms that we have. For example, over the course of the last 5 or so years, we've developed a conflict mapping platform with the economic community of West African states under USAID funded projects. So say we wanted to look a little bit more closely about the gendered impact of transhumance conflicts or climate insecurity, and we've established a pattern with the FSI, what we could do on our end at FFP is to pull up that beta test platform, which is what we call it, which typically includes us having included a variety of incident data received from multiple sources that are disaggregated by sex. So with that, we're able to establish hotspot areas, how much women and men might be impacted, whether it be fatalities, so on and so forth. So I just wanted to add a little bit more to that. So I'm not sure if Paul has anything else to add to that, but if there are any other questions on that, I will be happy to answer them, but recognizing that I don't want to derail or take over this conversation.
No, I think that was a very illustrative answer. I saw a hand from Karen. Was there a question that Karen, did you want to unmute and ask?
Yes, hi. My name is Karen Demerudis. I am from Mexico, so hello to every time zone here. It's pretty sunny here, so yeah. So my question is regarding my actual region. Normally we tend to focus on Africa, on East Asia, Middle East when it comes to climate security and climate nexus with insecurity and conflict. But little is said about Latin America, so I just wanted to, take advantage of hearing the experts and what they have to say on what's going on in this region, because in my perspective, it's just like in the middle everywhere. It's not there yet with a bunch of fragile states, maybe not as much as Africa has, for example. And maybe it's not yet there as countries with most, fragility in terms of climate change. It's somewhere there in the middle. And sometimes I feel that makes the region kind of be a bit neglected. So I just want to, take advantage of this and listen to what you guys have to say.
Yeah, that's something that I think a lot of conflict affected states have noted is, they only get attention when the conflict really comes to a head, which is exactly, I think, what Liz was focusing on, is how we need to be looking at that upstream, and we need to be integrating these things to places like Mexico that are not crumbling yet, right? Like that's exactly where we need to be focusing some more of our time and our funding. Liz, do you want to speak to that at all here?
Well, I couldn't agree with you more, and thanks for pointing out that that's what I was, that you said it a little more eloquently, that I was trying to get at that upstream prevention in areas that are going to do worse. again, some areas aren't going to do worse. Some areas are going to do better. So it's understanding, and that's where the data is so important. And Paul, I saw you in the chat. I just want to make it very clear. I'm a huge fan of the Fragile State Index. I helped. I was part of the launch. I keep it. It's on one of my tabs that I go to all the time. But it's a story, right? And you have to look at the data specifically, right? Like I referenced Ethiopia, and obviously there's conflict now, but before it sat high on conflict watch list, but it had some resiliency, some authoritarian resiliency, and other things that didn't, no one really worried about conflict at that time. So if you're looking at the Americas, I'll say really quickly the United States, right? People think, oh, it's the United States. We are, and Wendy hit it head on, worsening social cohesion than any other country, as said by the Fragile State Index. That played out in COVID. Countries that had good social cohesion did better before the vaccine, even now. So you're looking at those factors of problematic. In the United States, we can't even say, if you say climate change, you're on one side of the aisle or the other side, right? So that's a real problem. One quick problem in the United States, experts say the next big housing crisis that could trash the economy again would be so much flooding that a lot of Americans have very expensive homes, second homes, or homes sitting on our coasts, for example. That's one expert's opinion, for example. Okay, so then when you start moving down into Mexico and the Northern Triangle region, one of the things that gets said, and this is still a problem between conflict and climate experts. I was actually listening to PeaceCon's session on climate change at USIP today, and the ambassador from the AU was like, the drought caused the conflict in Darfur. It caused Syria. And you have a lot of climate experts that won't go there yet. So there's still a tension there between conflict and climate folks. And that's why we try to say, like, it's compounding. We haven't gone to that direct causal yet, even though some do. So I think, again, it's that narrative, right? You just said it. We can't seem to get that messaging on there. In the Northern Triangle, we really have talked about that in terms of how it affects migration, how it affects socioeconomic issues down there, and what's driving violence or migration. So again, thinking about how you can link it, where it is going to be a problem, but make sure you're very clear if it isn't going to be a problem. You don't just do a wide, take a wide swath to it all.
Yeah, I think that is spot on. So many, especially scholars and people who want to, don't want to be, so direct with their words because they're very careful, and words have meaning, and people are not wanting to say, like, yes, climate change causes conflict, because there are many ways that it doesn't, right? But there are many ways that it does. And so there is, I think you've identified this tension between being clear enough to be siding with some of the science, but also making sure that you're leaving space for that multi-causal conversation that is so important. And I think you mentioned it, the migration conversation is, I think, where you can start to bring in a lot of the issues in Central and Latin America, where that's somewhere where the United States is very invested, is starting that conversation within the migration route, as it were, because you have to get your foot in the door to start talking about climate somehow. And in Africa, that's, you can go about it in one way, and I think that you can't necessarily go about it in the same way when you're talking about Mexico or the other countries across Central and South America. And it is also entirely different if you go north and you're talking about the Arctic and the indigenous peoples up around the Arctic Circle. So I think that there are a variety of ways to get this conversation into the right ears, right? I want to take the next hand I saw was Fiorella. If you'd like to unmute and ask a question.
Hi there, thanks so much. I actually just posted, it's more like a comment, a question. I work at the United Nations. I'm a political affairs officer and I work in DPPA. So conflict prevention is our bread and butter. And I fully agree with what Liz was saying. I mean, we need to go in that direction. But so I'm also working on Latin America, in the Latin American region, and I fully agree with what Karen just said. And if you look at the literature, there's a lot on Sahel, Middle East, Asia. But I wonder then if it's also an issue of terminology. Seguridad climática, climate security, I don't feel like it resonates that much to Latin American scholars. I'm not an expert, but this is my, there is a complex relation with security issues, violence related to public security rather than human security. But then you do hear a lot about justicia climática, climate justice. Which then are kind of like all part of the same complex vicious circle. But I wonder if it's an issue of words. If anybody has any thoughts on that. I mean, I'm just exploring this idea of climate security versus climate justice. Thank you.
I love that comment. I think that is such an important part of this conversation. And we often lose the nuances of words when we only have these conversations in English as well. And I think that that's also part of the is that our scholarly and our academic conversations are often happening in English, which I think loses some of the nuances of those words. Did anyone have want to respond directly to Fiorella's comment?
No, I can come in very briefly that yes, terminology absolutely, I think plays a big role. And actually, if you kind of talk about this kind of field of work around climate and conflict, there are a lot of terminologies being used, and constantly new kind of ways of explaining it are being introduced by donors, by scholars, by practitioners. And I think it really kind of holds back the action on this issue, and I think that's it's a shame. And yeah, there's a real need to kind of come to a bit of a shared language, which will help to get everybody into action. But at the same time, I also see it can be a risk, like you're pointing out here, Fiorella. It's a beautiful name, sorry. Yeah, you know, if we kind of decide to set on, for instance, climate security, indeed, that can be pushing away certain countries who really don't, or individuals or groups that don't really kind of want to associate themselves with a concept like security. So I think we need to be really, really careful around that. And yeah, climate justice. Definitely. I mean, we have seen across the world how that has really kind of mobilized large groups of people, especially the young generation. So yeah, thanks for raising this point. I'm not able to give you the answer, but I think it's a really important point that you're raising.
Yeah, and I think you also really connect with what Liz had pointed out about this idea that in the previous US administration, we couldn't use the phrase climate change, but we could kind of still get around it by calling it a threat multiplier. So it kind of gave birth to these various euphemisms, right? And we used to call it global warming, and then people stopped understanding what that meant, and were throwing snowballs in the Senate. And so I think you hit on a very important issue, which is how we talk to each other, but also how we talk to policymakers, and how we talk to the public about not just what Liz mentioned about, you know, raising awareness and then what, right? Like, so it's not just being able to speak the same language, but being able to make action happen, and what language is going to be most useful in a variety of different contexts. I want to invite Tom, you have left 2 comments that are excellent in the chat. Do you want to unmute and bring yourself into the conversation? Okay, so it sounds like he is happy to stay in the chat and just bring up some various excellent points, focusing on not just the extractive industry and the extractive problem debate in Latin America, and some of these other issues over here. So please feel free to go check out the chat. And let's see, we've got a hand from Natalie. Would you like to unmute and share your question?
Thanks, Emily. So yeah, I'm Natalie Fiertz, now with the environmental security team at the Simpson Center, but formerly with FFP, working with so many of you lovely people. So first, thanks for bringing together this great panel. My question is for Liz. You talked about you emphasized the importance of climate adaptation for conflict prevention, but you also noted the gap that often exists in practice between sort of the conflict and the climate worlds. So to stick with sort of your theme of trying to focus on solutions, how do we bridge that gap, both generally and then also, particularly through integrating a climate lens into the existing global climate funding mechanisms, particularly as we get closer to COP27, which is shaping up to be the adaptation COP?
So that's such a great question, and it's good to see you. First of all, one of the issues, and this is something that when I first started working on it, is that a climate change is like almost equivalent to technology, right? It can be very geeky and very technical. So that's one of the things in our policy that we talk about is coming up with, and that, it's a shared language, terminology that both, experts, whether you're a conflict expert or you're a climate expert, can actually agree on, and they can talk enough about each other's stuff so that you're not talking past each other. And I think that's really, we're getting better at it, which is why, we've been inviting the climate scientists in so that they understand us and we understand them. And I think that that's a really important piece of it. Paul in the chat put, it's got to be more than US donor, the US donors or donors. And I totally agree with that. However, I say this all the time. If you don't fund it, if you don't resource it, you can't do it. So, and that's, one of the reasons why I kind of wanted to hit on the message that, wow, the US government is taking this seriously. And working with other international donors that had actually been doing it, right? And so that's really important too. So but it's also making sure that all this rhetoric is in these strategies, but that it actually gets implemented. And that's all on us to hold the donors, bilateral, multilateral, accountable. And one of the best ways to do it is to show through solutions. Look, this is, this was the problem here, and this is what we did about it. And there's so much great work that the peace building field has in the climate sector because climate, natural resource management has been driving conflict in areas. So there's a lot there, and we have to make sure that we tell that story well.
Jessica, do you want to add on to that?
Yeah, I really think that's really important what Liz is saying, and we addressing climate and security risks is we really have to learn by doing. We don't have the answers. I mean, we can kind of come up with some suggestions as to what could be solutions, and Liz had a great step at that, and we can have a whole different session to kind of go more into detail and kind of get information from different practitioners that are working on this issue. But yeah, we really need to have that opportunity to step up our efforts to address climate security and really take a very serious kind of effort to learn from that and communicate it. And I think that's at the moment really still kind of really missing. There's a lot of there's significant funding available to research the links between climate and conflict, but there's just very little funding available to really start doing it and to encourage the communities from the peace building security sector to work together with the climate change or wider kind of resilience building community. And yeah, just wanted to really echo the importance that progress is being made in that sense.
Thank you. I think that's excellent. So I want to go ahead and give you our panelists an opportunity to provide a wrap up. I know it is late where our panelists are sitting in London and Accra and all over. So I want to end on time. So I'd like to invite each of you to give yourself a concluding sentence or two and just where you see the next steps in this conversation. Jessica, shall we start with you since you talked last?
Sure, and I'm also in the probably latest time zone. I'm in India. It's close to 3 o'clock in the morning, and you have been seeing me fighting mosquitoes. Sorry about that. Yeah, so just basically building on the point that I've just made, we really kind of need to get our act together and really start addressing those climate security risks in all those different contexts where this is emerging, where we see hotspots emerging. And personally, coming from a peace building organization, I'm super excited that climate change, I mean, besides all the doom and gloom, it also provides a really good opportunity to kind of do peace building, because we are seeing in our work that working on issues around land, water, forest can be really, really sensitive. But if you kind of bring in the perspective of climate change, it can really kind of act as a very neutral entry point to bring kind of different stakeholders that are in conflict with each other around the table, as opposed to kind of bringing them together around an issue around water. The people are more willing to kind of accept that climate change is something that just happens to everybody. Everybody gets affected by it. There's no culprit in that way between those conflict parties. And so I think for peace building sector, it's really also a great opportunity to explore how we can kind of use climate change as a way to build peace and at the same time build that climate resilience with partners from the climate change and resilience community. Thank you.
Put that on a t-shirt and I would wear it. Dan, what are your concluding thoughts?
So I'd like to just underscore something I mentioned, which is that climate change is very much a systemic threat, and from there I'd like to underscore something that Liz said, which is, adaptation. I remember during my studies there was a tendency to favor this notion of systemic change over adaptation, which is all well and good, but in some countries that's just not viable. Some countries we're just dealing with the threat far too soon for that to be viable. And we stop emitting the amount of CO2 and methane, etc. now that we do now, and climate change is just going to continue for the next 30-40 years. It's just not going to stop. So adaptation is just key, and that's my concluding remark essentially, is that no matter what we do, we're still going to have to face the consequences of climate change, and so adaptation has to be part of the equation.
All right. I think that is a key part of this conversation. Wendy, final thoughts?
Yes, obviously I will be coming at this from the gender angle. And I think quite a bit of work has been done in the last couple of years focusing on the interrelatedness between gender, conflicts, and climate change. But I do think, though, that since it's such a complex issue, there's some connections that are missing in research and policy responses. And for that, Paul asked a really good question earlier on, immediately after I concluded my presentation, talking about how the difference between fragility, or the gender dimensions between man-induced climate change and natural disasters. And there are also topics like how gendered considerations drive climate insecurity and climate change. So I do think that there's still quite a lot of ways to go on this particular issue to critically analyze how gender is the key link between insecurity and climate change. So I think for that, we just need to be moving onwards and upwards, and hopefully receive more funding to focus on such research to help with these policy responses that are effective and durable.
Upstream preventive policies, yes. Paul, tell us your concluding thoughts, please.
I'm easily influenced by the brilliance around me, so I hope I don't steal anyone else's thunder. But I think that when we're looking at these problem sets, to highlight Liz's fact that we so often look at problems as opposed to opportunities, that I think, you know, the Fragile States Index or any other set of information and data is where we should be starting from an informed place, and then really working to develop what it is that is going to be compelling to policymakers and to the population writ large to get them to push policymakers. So working on those narratives like Liz was talking about, and driving that home through an education effort, and then really looking to find ways to not have those who are working on these challenges be put in a corner, even if it's a well-resourced one, but to really recognize that these threats or these security challenges are widespread enough that they warrant a radical shift in the way that we do almost everything. And so that our approach to addressing them needs to be cross-cutting. And that needs to be part of a discussion in every sector around the world in order to begin to both mitigate and adapt to the risks that we're confronted by.
Excellent. I love that. I would openly work in a well-resourced corner. That's what working from home feels like, but all right, Liz, take us home.
So I just want to say, I agree with everything that people have been saying. Also, adaptation, so critical. How do you make sure, around the governance sector, that if there's flooding, if it is, let's say, building a levee, that's some adaptation, for example, but also look at what's the conflict driver around, let's say, again, just in the United States, how climate change is so polarized. What is creating that polarization? The social cohesion issues. Remember that there is a conflict driver in there, that could be having an impact. We're probably going to hit that 1 degree, 2 degrees, whatever it is. So we have to, I can't agree more, we have to get on the adaptation, the mitigation, and the governance issue around the climatic hazards. No country is immune, including the United States. But really think about, under this administration in the US, it's exciting. These policies are here. But again, climate experts will tell you, the Obama administration pretty much broke their heart, and I watched it happen. We need to make sure that we hold all our governments accountable wherever you are, and make sure that we are pushing for what we know. We know what works, and we all have to be accountable for that.
Thank you so much, Liz. What a hopeful and actionable wrap up for us to end on. I just want to thank everyone on the panel who spoke, again, everyone at the MPACS conference who helped us with the technical and logistical planning for this, and everyone in the audience who stuck it out with us for what is, I assume, a very late night for some of you. And a special award goes to Jessica for staying up at 3 a.m. in India and dodging the nighttime mosquitoes. So I just want to go ahead and wrap up and wish you all thank you and a wonderful evening.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye all.